بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Good evening and welcome. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to Zaytuna College Black History Month lecture. Now, just a brief background on Zaytuna College. Zaytuna College is a Muslim liberal arts college, started here in Berkeley, California. This is our 5th year, graduating our first class this past May, and hopefully this will be a place to continue to grow and expand while incorporating the work of not only Islam, but Islam in the context of American society as well as the globe. This is an annual lecture series in terms of Black History Month series, and it's important for us as we begin to set up our presence in Holy Hill, that we constantly remember and recall the resistance, the struggle, the contribution of communities that have come before us and continue to struggle to make a space and a place for all of us. So in celebrating Black History Month, Zaytuna College is honored and really honored to host this series of lectures with the hope and desire to inspire people. Because we often look at history and stop and contemplate how great or ungreat history was, but in this sense we fail to recognize the reason that we look at history, which is specifically to give us a sense of awe for what have transpired, both the positive and the negative, but to come back and to urge us all to take action and to go back to rebuild and to continue the work that has been done before us. It is also for us to look at individuals like many of us that were deemed to be regular individuals, but confronted with the challenges, they arose and became heroes, not because they wanted to, but because they put themselves to the challenge and they inspired generations. So in essence, what we want to is actually to be heroes, but not the ones that they play in commercials on TV and therefore marketing you as a hero just to sell a product, but rather to be heroes that transform and change society. Black History Month is about resistance. It's about resistance and against the miswriting and the complete erasure of Africans and African Americans' narrative from the pages of history. And in celebrating African American struggle and Black History Month, it is actually to celebrate the constant and continuous resistance against racism, the constant fight against the multiple modes of erasures, the struggles against being erased while being present, because you could be present but actually erased from having meaning to contribute to the present that you are part of. And in essence, you could say that African American history, as well as we'd say Native American history, is the struggle of being present, absent, and then absented from the pages of history on a regular basis, and therefore having multiple people speak on your behalf. We remember the past while honoring the dignity, the perseverance, the struggle, the creativity of the people that inspired and aspired all of us, and wanting all of us to be taken to the mountaintop. Not to look down at the people at the bottom, but to lift all those from the bottom up and to take a different notions of history. Today, more than ever, we most doubly affirm and work both in words and deeds that Black lives and many lives do matter, and not only because of Ferguson or Oakland or many places around the world. It has to be the epistemic by which we operate, that we have to affirm both in words and deed that lives do matter and Black lives do matter at this particular time, where every 28 hours another African American is dead as a result of police brutality, but there are many, many others that die and they go unnoticed, unreported, faceless, nameless, and therefore it's up to us to actually recall and put their names on the history books so we could actually change the reality that makes it possible for them to die unnoticed. Today's lecture, we are honored to have with us John Powell, who really have committed his life and his contribution to challenging structural racism. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and a wide range of issues including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is currently the executive director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society. And it's important to have those fair and inclusive society because you could be included on the principle of unfairness, and you could be fair but not included. And as such, it's very important that these two are actually set in motion of thinking in fairness and inclusive society, which support research to generate specific prescriptions, so it's applied research that could actually make change in the lives of many. In addition to being a professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Powell holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He was recently, before he arrived to us in here, the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity at the Ohio State University. And I was joking with Sadiq before now that they must be enjoying their presence in California considering the weather back east. And as such, we welcome him here at California, and I know that the work of the Institute is magnanimous. So without taking any further of the time, first, I want to direct all of your attention at the end of the lecture. John Powell will be signing his book that is outside, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. So make sure to pick up the book outside. It's really a very important reading at this critical time where many people are saying that we have reached to a colorblind society or a post-racial society, but this is actually, in essence, having racism without racists, and therefore we need to confront and include the subject of race as a central epistemic in our discussions about fair and inclusive society. So it's my honor to invite Professor John Powell to address us, and it's an honor for us to have him here at Zaytuna.
Good evening. So the theme of my talk tonight is othering and belonging. And it's actually part of a larger theme which we will explicate in a conference at the end of April, and hopefully all of you will come. So part of the way to think about othering and belonging is simply to think about who is fully recognized as a contributing member of society. Who belongs, not just in society writ large, but in different spaces. Who belongs in stories, who belongs in culture, and then who's erased, who's invisible, who's noticed but not seen. So this is a universal issue. It affects race, it affects religion, it affects gender, it affects sexual orientation, it affects disability. How do we actually create a space, a culture, a story, structures to say you belong or you don't belong? And it could be done explicitly or implicitly. In the United States, one of the great divides and one of the great ways in which we demonstrate that people don't belong is in the context of race. And as this quote suggests, we live in a deeply divided America. We live in a highly segregated America. And it's the interaction of race, region, and movements that actually replicate this deep divide. And this deep divide we would not understand without looking through the prism of race. And so whether we talk about tax revolt, civil rights, white backlash, the New Left, the Christian right, the Tea Party, none of those things make sense unless we understand the role of race, which is different than understanding disparities as they affect racialized people. So the anxiety around race actually is what Michael Olney and Howard Winnick calls a master narrative about not belonging in America. And I would go so far as to say that master narrative gets deployed in other domains, whether we talk about gay rights or whether we talk about religion. In the United States, when we talk about inequality and not belonging, there's a tendency to sort of focus on the economy. And some people would say, why don't we just fix the economy and, of course, all the other problems go away? What I would suggest to you is that political inequality is preceded by, economic inequality is preceded by political inequality. In fact, economic inequality is caused by political inequality. And political inequality in the United States, certainly since the late 60s, early 70s, has been generated by racial anxiety and the anxiety of the other. So another way of saying it is that we can't understand economic inequality without understanding the role that race has played in actually creating the space for economic inequality. There are different ways of measuring inequality, from wealth to income to life expectancy to membership, political participation, and almost any axis we look at, we see race being incredibly important. And again, 2 quotes: "Race is the biggest reason that the United States, unique among advanced countries, is ruled by a political movement that is hostile to the idea of helping citizens in need." Not just Black people, not just Latinos, not just Native Americans, the very idea of helping people in need, which affect whites, which affect the majority population, is an anathema in the United States. And the reason for this is driven by race. And again, to quote Paul Krugman, "One key message of this book," meaning his book, The Consciousness of a Liberal, "which many readers may find uncomfortable, is that race is at the heart of what has happened to the country I grew up in. The legacy of slavery, America's original sin, is the reasons we are the only advanced economy that doesn't guarantee health care to our citizens. White backlash against the civil rights movement is the reason America is the only advanced country where a majority of political parties want to roll back the welfare state." So again, these impulses is not limited to people of color. They actually affect the structure of our society that we all live in. Now, some people believe we'll be saved by the demographics, that we soon will be a majority-minority country. It's not quite that simple. If having a numerical majority was the key to actual political and economic power, then the most powerful group in America and across the world would be women. So numbers alone will not rescue us. We have to look at structures, power, plus the meaning of race constantly shift. It's not clear who will be white in 2050 and who will be not. Over 52% of Latinos self-identify as white. If that number sticks, so instead of white with Hispanic surname, they just become whites like the Irish did, then there will be more white people in America in 2050 than there are today in percentage terms. We have to look at structures and how structures actually enhance or marginalize people. So it's not simply looking at individual intent. The way we organize structures actually enhance some people through recognizing their religion, through recognizing the way they interact with the world, through recognizing their language, and through recognizing their situatedness in structures. For example, we live in a society that work is not defined in terms of childcare or taking care of sick parents. Now, who does that work in our country? Women. So we're saying that doesn't count as work. It doesn't help in terms of you getting a pension. Work is what men do. And so we actually define work through the performance of men. Now, some women actually would do that work as well, but it's extremely gendered, and it affects the way we think about Social Security. When we talk about our being, we recognize our being, we have multiple beings, and we organize our sense of self, individually and collective, on different axes. The dominant axis in terms of the left in the United States is economic. We think of ourselves in terms of how much stuff we have, how much wealth, how much money. We think that's the most important aspect of ourself. But we also understand that power matters, and power is largely expressed through political voice. Can you make the rules of the game? Can you change structures? Can you organize who gets to vote? All these are political questions. So we also recognize that politics and political being matters. And of course, economic being, what we have, and rules of the game, we recognize those two things matter. They're related to each other. The thing that we have a hard time recognizing is that how we think of ourselves, both individually and collectively, who we are, not what we have, who we are, matters as well. In fact, I would say the driving force for much of what's happening in America today is the question of who are we? As Samuel Huntington, a conservative pundit, wrote a book titled, Who Are We? Who are we? And in case you don't know, Huntington wants to tell us who we are. And he says we're not an immigrant country, we're a settler country. And if you want to come to this country, you got to adhere to the rules, norms, culture, and practice of the settlers. Who are those settlers, Dr. Huntington? He tells us in case we don't know. And they were not German, they were not Italian, they were not Polish, they were not even white people. He said there were two groups that settled this country. They were Anglos and Saxons. And they had a particular culture, a particular religions. They were Protestants, not Catholics, and certainly not Muslims. They were English speaking. And he's saying anyone else who comes essentially as a guest, and you have to adhere to the norms of that dominant group. So when the Tea Party argues that we got to take our country back, they're not making an economic argument. They're not saying corporate America has taken the country. They're saying there are people who don't adhere to our sense of collective being. And our sense of collective being are Protestant, Anglo-Saxons, English-speaking. Now, if we were a little less politically correct, we'd just say white folks, because that is the description that they have in mind. And they're trying to be generous by saying, if you perform whiteness, we might accept you. And performing whiteness has very specific historical roots. So I would say the problem of the 21st century is the problem of who we are, the problem of our ontological being, and the anxiety about who we are. This is not just a problem in the United States, it's a problem in Europe. And Putnam got blasted for suggesting that, in a sense, the growing diversity in Europe and the United States would challenge us in the 21st century. He said this in the 1990s, that the growing diversity, could Europe be a liberal country? Could Europe be a country with a strong welfare society when a number of people were not from Europe? And if you think about the reason, going back to Krugman, who argues the reason the United States does not have a strong welfare system, which basically means a system that allows us to care for each other, can only be understood in the context of race. So as we have this growing diversity, the question of who we are individually and collectively challenges the very notion of the state. Now, these questions are profoundly spiritual and religious questions, as well as questions about citizenship. Who are we? So when we confront that question collectively in any given society, it always leans into some kind of spiritual religious understanding. And what some writers have suggested is that we live in this complex world now where we are bumping into each other, and who we are along political axis and spiritual axis don't cohere. So one of the questions is, how do we actually create a society, a space where we are multiple selves, where we are diverse selves, where we speak different languages, where we eat different food, where we have different practices, and yet we all belong. We're not othered because we dress differently. We're not othered because we look different. We're not othered because we worship differently. We're not there. We're a long ways from there. We're still fighting for who we are collectively. And part of the reason the fight is so intense is that the dominant culture understands that their dominance requires adherence by the other. The very notion of the other is a challenge to the dominant. And so they're willing to have people who don't look like them as long as they can control them, as long as they can order them. And it doesn't just extend to people, it extends to nature itself. Think about Genesis 1:26. God gave man dominion over the earth. And I say, things that are different than us, one way we deal with them is we colonize them. We control them. We police them. And so we tend to like parks, but we don't like the forest. The forest is unruly. The forest is mysterious. The forest is scary. So you have all kind of Western stories, Red Riding Hood, about what happens when you go into the scary forest. Bad things happen. And so if we're going to have trees and grass, we want them under our control. We call those parks. And so right now we're at this place with nature where we've extracted ourselves from nature, and nature needs to be domesticated. It doesn't work out so well. And so this very notion of a self that's in relationship with nature, this relationship with the other, is a damnation on whiteness. And when I talk about whiteness, I'm not talking about people's phenotype. I'm not talking about people's genes. I'm talking about people's social, political, and cultural practices in relationship to the other and relationship to nature. And this idea that we have to be in relationship with each other creates fear and anxiety. And so think about segregation. Think about apartheid. Think about reservations. All of those are expressions of saying, let's contain the other so that he or she does not pollute the political community as well as the physical community. So when you have things like Ferguson, and they say the police was really afraid of the black man, I say many white people, and certainly many white people who become police, are already afraid. They're afraid of 12-year-old young black boys. And the same, we could argue in terms of countries. And I went on national television, national radio, and said, yes, all life matters. And so when you see fear, whether it's fear of people in Israel or fear of the police in the United States, it's the fear of the other, which requires control and policing, and extends all the way to controlling by death. This is James Baldwin. James Baldwin says, we're all androgynous, not only because we are all born of a woman impregnated by the seed of a man, but because each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the seed of the other, male and female, female and male, white and black, black and white. We are part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair. And so very often do I, but none of us can do anything about it. What Baldwin is saying, he's rejecting the notion that there is an other, that we always, always carry the other inside of us. The other is us. It's the unacknowledged us. And when you think about the fear in this society in terms of the one-drop rule or black penetration, what Baldwin is suggesting is more than inconvenient, it's scary that black people are inside of white people. And so we prefer not to read James Baldwin. We prefer to have a sense of belonging that erases the other, that dominates the other, that controls the other, that whitewashes the other. And what we see is that the country is struggling with the other that won't be erased, the other that won't be dominated. And what we see is that the country is having increased racial anxiety. This is empirical. And until we name this and come up with an alternative, the country will be deeply divided. Now, I should just say one thing about this divide. This divide is not just a natural phenomena. This divide is a strategic space that the elites activate to attack the state, to attack the legitimacy of the state that will respond to citizens, to make the state, the welfare state, illegitimate. It repurposes the state for one reason. The state is to serve the elites. And it serves the elites by deregulating, it serves the elites by lowering taxes, and it serves the elites by extending the military and police to the other. That becomes the primary and dominant role of the state. But the reason it can activate foot soldiers like the Tea Party for that neoliberal state, again, is the anxiety over the other. We need strong police because the other is out of control. Think about Richard Nixon and today. Richard Nixon was running for president in 1968. He was losing. He was behind in all the polls. He gave a talk in one of the suburbs in the United States, and he talked about law and order. Law and order. There was only one television program on major television that dealt with law and order at the time, and that was Dragnet. When he gave that speech, his ratings shot up with the white community because they understood the law and order meant that black people were out of order. And not out of order because they were smoking dope, not out of order because they were killing. They were out of order because they were claiming to be part of society. They were insisting that they belong. They were insisting that laws that formally segregated them and incarcerated them for being black, the laws themselves were bad. That's what civil disobedience was about. That's what the March in Selma was about. I have a right to vote. How dare you claim you have a right to vote? How dare you say Black Lives Matter? You are out of order. And so when Nixon said that in response to the civil rights movement, the anxiety among whites was released and Nixon won for president. And now you can't turn on television without some program on law and order. Every network television is talking about law and order. Again, how do we police, control the racial other? Whether the racial other is a different religion, whether the racial other is crossing borders, or whether the racial other looks different in terms of skin tone. Now, as bad as Nixon was, and remember, this is the height or the start of a new form of an economy, a new global economy that was taken off. The economy that we had prior to Nixon's run is very different than the economy we have today. This was the start of the white backlash. So Reagan took Nixon one better. So Nixon called for law and order. Reagan called for a war. He called it a war on drugs. When he called for a war on drugs, only 3% of Americans thought we had a drug problem. But everyone understood that the drug problem, at least in the minds of Americans, not the facts, in the minds of Americans, was expressed through black people. And I wrote something at the time that the war on drugs was really saying, this is a war on black people. Policing them is not enough. We need to declare a war on them. And it's not surprising that once you declare a war on people, two things happen. You don't just bring in police, you bring in the heavy artillery, you bring in the tanks, you bring in the helicopters, you bring in things of mass destruction. And you even further push those people outside the circle of human concern. They are not citizens, they are not people, they are the enemy. Now, in terms of understanding of this, we've actually had some new information that helps us. That is, we know now that people have explicit attitudes and feelings and implicit attitudes and feelings. And implicit is what we would call the unconscious or subconscious. And they're not the same. They don't track the same. And much of racial anxiety is about implicit. And there's some counterintuitive things about the implicit. The implicit is not so individual. The implicit is deeply social. The implicit is actually reading the environment and taking cues from it as to how to make associations. Why do we know that black people are dangerous? Because we see on Law and Order, day in and day out, people being arrested for all kinds of things are black. The unconscious takes that information and creates a negative association with black people. It's the air. So there's this interaction between the unconscious and the conscious. The unconscious speaks a different language. The conscious processes about 40 bits of information a second, 40. During that same second, the unconscious processes 11 million bits of information. So all the work is being done at the unconscious level. So a person might tell you that they really are not racist. that they don't even see race, that they're colorblind, and they may be telling you the truth as far as their conscious goes. But we can test what's going on in the unconscious, and that's one of the things that's relatively new. And so even while the conscious is claiming to be colorblind, the conscious, which is not politically correct, is having meetings, sending memos, and organizing around race, around gender, around religion. And unless we disrupt this, both through our understanding of its relationship with structures and our understanding of how it impacts our behavior and feelings, we will continue to have people who claim not to even notice race, but engage in heavily racialized behavior. So again, the unconscious is always interacting with our conscious. Now, one of the things, when I talk about the unconscious, I'm not just talking about biases that someone may have toward you. We actually incorporate the dominant language, the dominant narrative, and end up being affected by those same practices ourselves. So an example is something called stereotype threat. And stereotype threat works in interesting ways. First, there's this thing called priming. That is, because we have multiple identities, which identity would be the dominant identity in a particular situation? That's determined by priming and by the environment. So here's an example, and it's done by Claude Steele, who's the provost here at Berkeley, and when he was down at Stanford. He brings in a group of women at Stanford, and he says, I love teaching here at Stanford because these are Asian American women, I should say. I love teaching here at Stanford because there's so many bright women. And then 20 minutes later, he gives them a pop quiz, and they bomb the quiz. It's a math test, and they just tank. He brings in a second group of women, Asian American women, with exactly the same ability, from exactly the same pool. But this time he says, I love teaching here at Stanford because there's so many bright Asian American women. He gives them the same test. They knock it out of the park. They ace it. Now remember, these two groups have exactly the same ability. One group fails the test, the other group exceeds the test. What Claude has done is he primed an identity. The first group that took the test as women. And they, like all of us, are aware that women are not supposed to be good at math. And so their performance actually ends up reinforcing that stereotype. The second group took the test as Asian Americans. And they're aware that Asian Americans are supposed to be good at math, and their performance knocked it out of the park. Now that's not just true of those groups, that's true of all of us. We can activate a certain identity, and then identity will perform consistent with stereotypes in our society. When you give students a standardized test, and you have them first check off their race, if the students are Black and Latino, you just depress their performance on that test. Because they know, like most of us, that Blacks and Latinos are not supposed to be good on standardized tests. So you say, check off your race. You've activated. You've made more salient their race. So what we're getting some of the standardized test people to do now is to put it at the end of the test. Have them take the test, then check off their race. Don't activate, don't prime the race, which will adhere to the existing stereotype. So this is just an example of how powerful some of this stuff is. So this process of othering happens all the time. And there are things that we can do to actually activate othering, and the things we can do to activate belonging. So here's one. Have you ever walked into a room and you were the only one of some salient identity? There are 50, 100 people there, and you notice you're the only woman, or you're the only woman with a scarf, or you're the only Black person. What the unconscious starts doing is counting. And what you're looking for are other people with your same identity. And that counting is heightened if the environment gives you any signs of threat. So I got an offer to go teach at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's the flagship school in Texas. And they're showing me around, and they're recruiting me. They want me to come. And they say, ignore all the Confederate memorabilia around the campus. My unconscious is not going to ignore it. They say, we fought on the wrong side of the Civil War, but that's then. That's history. Why we don't have to, but it's still there. The same thing at University of Georgia. I was recruited there. It was even worse. They took me to Stone Mountain. I don't know if any of you are from Georgia, but Stone Mountain is a Confederate theme park. And I'm sitting in a space with my hosts. Some of them are black. And there's a video projected onto Stone Mountain of Robert E. Lee charging across the battlefield. And people are crying. Now, these people think they're recruiting me. This wasn't even unconscious. I'm saying, get me the hell out of here. Where am I? They were othering me. They were inviting me to be part of their performance of whiteness. They were inviting me to be Anglo-Saxon. I ain't Anglo-Saxon. I know that. I thanked them and really got on the first plane heading away from Georgia. So think about all the things we do every day to tell people, this is not your place. You don't belong. And sometimes we think people don't belong because we don't like them. But what Benjamin Franklin said is that we don't like people that we treat badly. It's not that we treat people badly because we don't like them. That once we demonize a people, that once we enslave a people, that once we put people in ghettos and barrios, we then tell stories about those terrible people. It's the very condition that creates othering. We institutionalize their othering. And then when they react, maybe they throw a rock at a tank. It's like, wow, look at those uncivilized people. We have to shoot them. I mean, did you see that? Did you see that rock coming at a tank? And tanks are designed to take bullets, but not rocks. And really what they're saying is that these lives do not matter because these people are othered. And it's support group-based discrimination. And it's institutionalized and structured into our world. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter. And so I did this years ago, looking at curriculum and looking at books. And still, in 2015, you pick up any book, and who's in there? I like movies, even some bad movies. But I'm always struck when you go to a movie and it's like, this is 200 years in the future. You say, okay, I like futuristic movies, and everybody's white. Really? 200 years in the future? There was a story in the New York Times, interesting story. It talked about the oldest European woman in the world, 115. I think it was a front page story, and you open up part A, and the story went on and on about this woman. And she's Italian. It's an amazing thing. My hat's off to her. She lived 115 years and she's still ticking. But this was the odd part of the story. It said she was the 5th oldest person in the world. And I'm thinking, why are we giving all this ink to the 5th oldest person in the world? And really what they were saying is that this is the oldest white person. I'm saying, who are the other 4 people ahead of her? What those of you who like football. Who finished fourth in the run to the Super Bowl? Who finished fifth in the run to the national title? We don't know. We don't celebrate fifth place finishers. We don't celebrate sixth place finishers. We don't celebrate eighth place finishers. But in this case, we say, this woman, the oldest European, her life matters. Not those other people, which were most likely to be from Japan or some Asian country. We don't know their name. We don't even care. So again, in a sense, without trying it, they're saying this person belongs. Those other four people that maybe is 117, 118, they don't matter. They're not Anglo-Saxons. This is a study that came out of UT Austin, where 80% of the white students were graduating after 5 years, 40-something% of Latino students graduating after 5 years, and only 20% of blacks. And the story that the school told was UT Austin is a hard place to matriculate. The work is hard. And these students went to substandard high schools and on and on and on. And so what they did, being good liberals, they wanted to fix those students. So they gave them remedial classes. They gave them extra help. Now think about this. When you say to the student, you're not smart enough, we're going to give you extra help. Well, fine, but you're also saying you're not smart enough. At an institution where smartness is the highest currency, you're not smart enough. And the young woman here, she always wanted to go to UT Austin. And she got there and she was flunking out. She was a good student in her high school. And she called her mother. And her mother said, honey, you might just have to accept the school is too hard. You're not smart enough. And there was this professor who had had a similar experience when he was in UT Austin, or some school, I think it was UT Austin, and he hated it. And what he did is he brought the students together, and what he focused on was not academics. He focused on how does it feel to be at UT Austin and to be black or Latino. And what they found is that their feeling of otherness that they were processing individually was collective. And they started talking to upperclassmen who also had these feelings. And within a very short period of time, the black students and Latino students were graduating at almost the same rate as the white students. By naming the othering, by challenging it, and by creating a collective space, they created a community. And the researchers were so taken aback, they said, that's not possible for these students are not that smart. How can they be doing this work? So othering is quite important. And how we think about people matters. When you see another human being, there's a part of the brain that lights up. We're wired to recognize our fellow species. When we other people at the extreme, that part of the brain does not light up. We literally, at an unconscious level, do not see certain people as human. There have been police reports where they've gone in and black people were dead, and in some of the reports they would say, no human life involved. So, young black men, people mass incarcerated, Muslims, these people, at a national level, much of the country do not see these people as human. And worse than not seeing them as human, because a tree is not human, but a tree is not a threat. So then we treat them very badly. And at the extreme, when we are only concerned with profit, with the elites, with corporations, all people get pushed outside of the circle of human concern. This is the extreme of neoliberalism, where we dehumanize not just the racial other, not just the religious other, we actually end up humanizing everyone. And of course it makes sense, because the other is already ourselves. So as we continue this practice of denying the other, we end up denying ourselves. So I'm going to go through these last slides quickly. How do you change implicit bias? Two things. Implicit bias is social, so it's in the environment. So one reaction is, let me fix this person who has this bias. But the bias is not really generated from the person, it's generated from the environment. It would be like kids with asthma. We're going to give you an inhaler, some anti-asthma medicine, but we're not going to fix the air. So what's generating this bias? It's the environment, and we need to focus on the environment. We need to focus on the structures that are actually organizing people's life outcomes. Are there ways to get in this building if you're in a wheelchair? If not, the building structure is othering people in a wheelchair. If you're blind, can you read the slides? Of course not. Do we have things that actually say, this space is yours, you belong here? Do we only have one person from some marginalized group as a token? So we need to think about how we actually create structures. And we do some of this through what we call opportunity mapping, by mapping out opportunities, how they function, and how they create a sense of belonging or not belonging. Our very neighborhoods is the way we arrange opportunity. Is there a place to just go shopping for food? We talk about food deserts. If you live in a food desert, I'll bet a dime to a donut you're not eating good food. You don't need good food. Good food is for humans. Why do you need good food? Now, you can go to the store and buy some liquor. How about that? Or cigarettes, or a gun, but not good food. Is there a park? Is there things that you need and your community needs to have full expression? And so part of the thing in terms of making people belong are the stories we tell, the structure and culture and how we locate people, the stories we tell. I'm sitting watching a movie with my daughter, and it's one of these bad D movies, a scary movie, and there's a monster of some kind, and the monster's in the closet, and the protagonist comes out, and it's this young teenage white girl, blonde hair, and she heads toward the closet, and my daughter goes, ah! I said, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to her. My daughter looks at me, have you seen this movie before? Not in a manner of speaking, no, but in a manner of speaking, I've seen it many times. And then, of course, here comes the black pizza boy. So now, he's dead. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And my daughter looks at me and says, how did you know that? Black lives don't matter, even in Hollywood. The first person killed, the only reason he's there is to die, right? And we have to protect the young white woman. And we see that over and over and over and over again. And we're sending a message to kids. We're sending a message that, yes, your life does not matter. So the stories we tell, who are the heroes in the story? I count. When I go to a restaurant in San Francisco where I live, and it's a big restaurant, every server is white. And then I see people who are picking up the dishes. They're Latino. And blacks are just absent. This is in San Francisco. This is a message. You don't belong. One last story, and then I'll end. I tell the story of going to San Francisco, and the new hip restaurants, they don't take reservations. They want everybody to be there clamoring to get in, right? That's the buzz. And so I'm in this restaurant, and there are hundreds of people in front of me all clamoring to sign their name so they can have some food that's overpriced. And the maitre d' looks over the crowd, I'm kind of tall, looks over the crowd and sees me. And it's like, sir, you in the back, can I help you? What do you want? And I say, I want the same thing all these people in front of me want. A table to have dinner. And what I interpreted him really saying is, what are you doing here? This place is for young white hipsters. What's an old black guy like you doing here? I was noticed, not seen, but noticed. And so this is the theme of othering and belonging. He was othering me. And this is the theme we're taking up in our conference in April 23rd to 26th. And we'll have people like Bell Hooks, so some of you may know, Charles Blow, some of you know, Andrew Solomon, and many others. And hopefully, we'll also have you. Thank you.
How do you feel, in context you're talking about racism and the racial problem in America and in general, what are your comments in terms of solving the problem and clearly identifying what it is to be a human being? The human question, because we're all human beings in essence, and you find among human beings a variation of things. It's not the variation that's the problem. It's the problem of defining human beings regardless of who they are racially and socially. So what do you think about that? And let me say this too. I'm a school teacher, so I deal with little beautiful minds every day. And I'm always trying to identify and to clarify what it is to be human so they can function better. So I'd like to hear your response to this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. It's actually a simple and complicated question all at the same time. So I have this exercise I do with my students sometimes. I say, close your eyes and think of a human being. And then I say, write down something about this person. And you can't think of a human being without thinking of race, gender, name, religion, language. So the abstract human being actually doesn't hold any currency. People are always situated somewhere in time, history, and culture. Those are just extra add-ons. And think about this. In the US context, or in the Western context, we think of the human being as ultimately the free-standing, disassociated individual. Think of a baby. You can't think of a baby without thinking of the baby's parents. We're all in some kind of relationship, and those relationships vary. So it's not enough in the abstract to think of human beings. We have to think about human beings in the concrete. And in the concrete, we actually manifest and express a lot of differences. Those differences aren't just add-ons. They actually inform who we are. But then, can we actually then come together in relationship? In fact, there are a number of social scientists that says a person outside a relationship ceases to be a person. That we only exist in relationships. What's the proper kind of relationship? So these are actually very complicated problems. The suggestion early on is, can we be post-racial? Can we see people without race? Race is socially constructed. I accept that. But so is the self. The self is socially constructed. What's not socially constructed? The question is, can we construct things socially that are also inclusive and fair and pluralistic? Can we accept our many different aspects of ourselves? So again, I think the lean toward inclusion is important, but it can't be, I'm including you because on all things that matters, you're just like me. That's already problematic. Can I include you with your difference? Can you include me? Who gets to make the template that includes? Who gets to make the structure, rules, and standards to include? So all of these are sort of really much more complicated questions than the old adage that we're all just individuals. No, we're not. I would say none of us are just individuals. We may be individuals, but not just individuals.
Because you made the reference to Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, and now lately with what's going on in the Muslim community, we have a hashtag Muslim Life Matters. And there has been kind of a dispute that we shouldn't be using that we should go back to Black Lives Matter, and kind of black activists within the community kind of bashing heads over that. And since you're both on stage, I thought it would be a good way to address it other than just a set of articles, but have a nice thorough explanation of what you think about those hashtags.
Well, you know, I'm supposed to do an interview tomorrow with NPR on some of these questions, and I'm sure you've seen the stuff happening in Washington where a Latino young man was just shot and killed by the police. Again, there's a tension because we want to say all lives matter, and all lives do matter, I believe. But that's not how our society performs. It performs as if some lives matter more than others. And we need to bring attention to that. And we say all life matters, we're ignoring the fact that every day we're performing that some lives matters less than others. And so we're not trying to certainly denigrate the lives of the police or white people. But in many ways, our society is already performing that. And so for the 2 policemen that were killed in New York, tragically, the whole city stopped. Thousands of people came out. The governor, you know, the mayor, the attorney general. We're saying those lives matter. That didn't happen in Ferguson. That didn't happen in Washington. So there are a number of groups that are deeply, deeply marginalized. And certainly we want to create a space where all of those lives matter. But to do so, I believe, also require us to look at how their lives don't matter. Because otherwise, we're whitewashing it. We're again saying, well, everybody. Everybody? So why is it that some kids go to elite schools with new computers and fancy? I mean, my granddaughter, she went to school where they were serving healthy, organic food for lunch. That's great. But there's certain schools where kids go to school deserts, and they're getting terrible food. So we got to actually talk about that. We have to talk about, the goal is really for all lives to matter, but we're not there, because some lives matters much less than others. I think when you talk about Muslims and blacks, or you talk about black Muslims, it's a little bit more complicated because you're talking about 2 marginalized groups. And I think it's important to sort of situate those groups in the conversation, to not prioritize one over the other. But there's, again, a level of complexity because these things are not analytics. These are things are performance. These things are, and so you want to be, without being categorical, you want to respect that if there's a movement that gets associated with a marginalized group, we actually acknowledge that in some way without being afraid of actually pushing it a little bit further. So, for example, in San Francisco, there was a big push back, actually, and I think appropriately so, when you saw signs saying, gay is the new black. What does that really mean? Or I was asked to be on a panel in basically an all-white group around the beloved community. Now, most people have no clue where that come from, and that it has a certain currency in the black community, but its history is actually much older than that. And I'll stop by saying my son, when he was younger, he wanted to wear a Malcolm X hat. And I said, fine. But first, do the research. Read the history. What does this really mean? Don't just appropriate it. And for black people in America, and maybe for other groups as well, much of our culture has been appropriated. And people say, black culture can go where black people can't. So there's always, I don't, even though I talk about television and stuff like that, I don't really watch it all that much. But the reality is, I know either in terms of rap and hip hop, the 3 of the 4 major artists being pushed forward were white, some of them were engaging in pretty clear white appropriation. And so white people are better at being black than black people. There's something probably wrong with that, because we're still keeping black people out, but we like something about them. But if we could dress it up as a white, that's better. So I think when you talk about dominant groups, and I think all groups are, no group is completely dominant. Every group has a story of suffering to some extent. But we have to be careful that we don't just appropriate. So if Black Lives Matter has become associated with Ferguson, then to be careful in terms of, as we sort of pull in other groups, that it's done in a respectful and historical way and not just appropriation.
If I may add, I think in here the debate, especially about having the hashtag Muslim Lives Matter, it is not taking into account or working racial analysis into the whole discussion, and therefore picking up on the black culture in terms of Black Lives Matter. So appropriation for struggle is problematic for me. So you could still speak about Muslim lives that are lost in North Carolina without having to associate to something that has become so common and understood, and then come back and engage the racial question and how some more lives don't matter than others. So we are not appropriating, but rather actually creating intertextuality in relation to the struggle. And I think that's the biggest challenge for Muslims, because immediately they want to link to speak about their suffering, which is important, but how to do it where you actually are empowering those that will be or should be in solidarity with you. And I think that's a fine navigation that has to take place, especially at a time where we're experiencing multiple layers of exclusion, multiple layers of oppression. And I think that's where the challenge for me in working around those questions.
I'm curious, what gives you hope, or what allows you to move forward in the work that you're doing in times when it feels like there's none?
A very interesting question. So those of you who know me well would know that there's a quote I like, which is, "Hope is nostalgia for the future." At some level, I don't have hope, but I'm not hopeless. There's a painting in my house that someone did in honor of me, and it says, "I'm not an optimist, nor am I a pessimist. I'm a possibilist." I think we matter. And James Baldwin again says, not everything faced can be won, but nothing can be won without facing it. So we engage. And to me, the essence of life is our collective engagement. And when my kids were young, I used to say, if I could wish them one thing, it would not be good health, it would not be money, it would not be, going to Berkeley. It would be engagement, to fully engage with life. And when we fully engage with life, we'll experience the panoply of life. We'll experience sadness, we'll experience joy, we'll experience loss, we'll experience love. But to be able to hold all that individually and collectively, to me, it's just the dance of life. And how it's going to turn out, who knows? But if we're engaged, we have something, from my perspective, even better than hope.
You talked about the difference between a subconscious racism and a conscious racism. I could see you'd fight the conscious racism, but how do we go about as a society fighting this subconscious racism? I know it's not an easy question, but it's something I think about.
Thank you. So a slight shift. Actually, I don't talk about unconscious racism. I talk about unconscious bias, which is not the same, because on the test, and you can go on Harvard Implicit Association test, we find that black people have biases against black people. Not as strong as the biases white people have against black people, because black people have some inoculation. I know my father's not dangerous. Many of you don't know that. Women have biases against women. Not as strong as male bias against women, because women will know women who do things that are kind of stereotypical. But you can't blame women for having biases against women in a society where the air is biased against women. You can't blame kids in LA, East LA, for having asthma when the air is filled with toxins. So it's not racism in the traditional sense. It's not racism in terms of personal animus. Now, sometimes people blanch when I say that because they say, you're letting white people off the hook. I don't think so. I'm not saying we're not responsible, that we shouldn't do anything about it, but it's not simply fixing the person. It's fixing the environment. And we can do things. We know how to clean up the air. Literally, we can go into a school or into a building and do an audit and say, all these things are activating negative associations. Once we become aware of that, in a sense, our responsibility is heightened because we're not just responsible for ourselves, we're responsible for the environment itself. And so I want to end racial domination. I want to end racial oppression. I want to end gender discrimination. I want to end exclusion of people with disability. I don't think the way to do that is simply to get people to like people who are disabled. If you want to do that, the best way to do that is not to sit down and get a person on the couch. Is to actually create structures, circumstances, and environment where we see powerful people with disabilities. So we see powerful women doing things that are counter-stereotypical. So I say a lot that in terms of data, when we see these disparities, it tells us where there's a problem. I went to Cincinnati when it was a period of time where they had killed 15 young African Americans, and then they were saying the African American community was rioting, and they brought me there as an expert to sort of help them sort of deal with the tension between the black community and the white and the police. And I said, what's the tension? Stop shooting people. I mean, it's simple. People should be mad. They're being gunned down in the street, and you're saying they got an attitude. So I think of it slightly differently, and I talk about structural racialization, structures that produce racialized, disturbing outcomes. So when President Obama announced the Recovery Act, we posted stuff on our website, and I wrote some articles saying the way the structure was put in place, it was going to hurt black people. Are we saying that Obama's a racist? No. He might have racial attitudes that are not flattering to black people because he grew up in America. But what we're saying is that these structures, these systems are going to produce negative outcomes. We need to change that. And I think to some extent, if we get overly concerned about is he or isn't he a racist, we're ignoring the structures and the work they're doing. I'll give you two last examples. When Katrina happened, I got calls from all over the country. Is George Bush a racist? It's like, who knows? What we do know is that he supports racialized structures that are harming black people. That we know for certain. But if you say George Bush is a racist, that becomes the focus. Well, he has a Latino grandchild. How could he be racist? He has black friends. He even likes watermelon. In a sense, it's missing the point. He's having structures that are producing negative outcomes. When we leave here, me and most of you will get in a car and drive home. Are you trying to heat up the environment? Are you trying to make climate change a problem for ourselves and our children? Are you trying to destroy the earth? And my guess is you would say no to all of those questions, and yet our behavior is problematic, individually and collectively. It doesn't mean we're bad people. So we have biases, and I could talk much more about that, or teach about that, but it doesn't make us bad people. And if we want to change those biases, the best way to do it is, to be somewhat more reflective, but to also change those structures and those stories and those associations that are producing those biases in the first place.
do you have any recommendations on how we might deal with sort of maybe a two-sided problem? One is our relationship to the broader society and the ways in which we feel othered and sort of separated out, but at the same time, the sort of internal differences we have and the racialized structures we have within our communities that are problematic. And I feel like there's a tendency to want to flatten those and think of like, this is what it means to be in this community, so that there's sort of a defense mechanism to sort of, pull together in that way. Do you have any suggestions? It feels like that's counterproductive, and yet it might be instinctual for the defensive nature to say, this is the family, and this is how we have to defend this outside threat. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on how to sort of not allow that process to sort of go on autopilot, or?
We'll have a couple, but I'm not close enough to the community to have very many granular suggestions. But there's a period of time, by analogy, in the black community that we flatten the black community. We talked about, this is what it means to be black. I remember going to Columbus, Ohio, to teach, and this guy who was head of the Urban League looked me up, another African American, and he said, I was talking to people where you came from, and they said, you're a bad dude. I should get in touch with you and work together. And they said, but they told me you're not really black. And I said, I'm not? And they said, no, you're vegetarian. So we had defined blackness as eating hog mogs and chitlins, and the black people who didn't perform that, somehow we were suspect. So we had to be a little bit careful about how tightly we draw these boundaries. And we all have multiple identities, and I believe a healthy society, a healthy world will allow us to inhabit our multiple identities. I went to see the movie Selma. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but I would recommend it. One of the things that was a little bit disturbing in the movie is the movie, just like the reality, maybe that's a good thing or bad thing, it closeted Byron Rustin. And some of you know who Byron Rustin was. He was the strategist for the civil rights movement. He was older, and he was gay. And because he was gay, and there was a whole thing about, we can't have a gay man out there. This is rooted in the black church and the black experience. We don't do gay. We don't do homosexuals. Yes, we do. And it seems to me to actually wrestle with that there's a certain degree of homophobia in the black community. There's probably homophobia in the Muslim community. And so to actually wrestle with that seems to me to create the possibility of a richer community and to stop a community that's being othered from othering others. And what we know, there was a period of time where people were like, after all the suffering that Jews have been through, they must be empathetic. Not, right? Because you're other, it doesn't mean you're going to be empathetic. And not to pander or pick on Jews, but I would fight with some of my Jewish friends, and they'd say, but you got to understand, 6 million Jews died as a result of Germany and the concentration camps. And part of my response was, and so what does it have to do with Palestinians? You want to go fight with Germany? I'd understand that. I might even be down with that. But you're saying your suffering in one situation allows you to ignore the suffering of other people or the suffering you're visiting upon other people. So we have to be willing to be compassionate, embracing, and critical all at the same time. And how that will play out in your particular community, with your particular structures, only you can tell that.
Take another question, and that we'll call it a night.
Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you. Thank you for coming tonight. I had a question. I always hear it, especially when it's related to race or religious at conferences and stuff like that. Like they're always saying build institutions. And my question is more in regards to, like in the field of education or in law, what would you deem to be more imperative? Because both of them have racism and like that otherness that you're talking about. It's embedded in both infrastructures. So how and why, if possible, if you could answer both, if not, then which one would you prefer, like which one would you recommend like attacking first, or that's probably not, being able to address the issue first, and also if there was any advice for someone who is interested in doing that.
Yeah. Again, a very good question. So there's a whole approach to this called systems theory, or when you talk about structures, we're talking about systems. And systems are complex. And the thing that's most important about systems, there are a lot of things that are important about systems, is that systems are interactive. So the thing to understand about systems are the relationships between things. Excuse me. So what's the relationship between education, housing, wealth, law? Understanding those relationships will actually tell you where to focus. I would say to focus on a thing outside of relationships is almost always inappropriate. Focus on the relationship between things. And the relationship you're looking for is what some people call inflection points or leverage points. You can also think about it in terms of disease. I gave a talk this morning to a health group, so I'm in that mindset. Let's say you wanted to infect all the people in San Francisco with measles. What's the best way to do that? I mean, no one would want to do that, but the best way to do it, though, would be to understand the network and the relationship between the people and the pathogen that you're actually going to introduce into the environment. Is it airborne? Is it contact? Is it, and you don't have to actually go have contact with 800,000 people in San Francisco. You look at networks, and once you understand networks, it's like one thing here, maybe on the BART train in a crowded afternoon, where everybody's then going off, and then they go off, and they go off, will be the most effective way of distributing outcomes. This is systems. Systems are about networks. So if you understand the relationship, you could then say, both positively and negatively, if I want to infect this system, this is the inflection point. So it's not saying education, housing, it's saying, what are we trying to do, and what are the 2 or 3 inflection points that will populate across the whole system? The other hand, you could also say, I'm an educator, so because things are interrelated, if I do and think about education right, again, it will populate across the whole system. So in that sense, systems are not linear, and you're not sort of saying education is more important than voting, is more important than jobs. These things exist in relationship. At any given time, a person may have one thing more important in their lives, but really you're trying to affect all of them.
We know that sometimes allies can sort of reproduce the othering dynamic by taking over in the sphere of social justice or advocacy. And yet we know also sometimes that you're in the group whose belonging is denied, and you can scream and advocate for structural change all you want, and nobody listens to you except maybe to tell you to stop making so much noise. So I was just wondering, as we think about working towards a society in which more people belong, in which everyone belongs, how do we think about our own social location and the influence that has on the work that we in particular do?
Okay, great question. So one thing implicit in your question is power. We all have differential power, and we're in institutions that allow us to leverage power. So how do we leverage that power? How do we get that power? So not in a personal sense, that actually allows us to create the kind of society we want. I would say if we can, it's also important to think about very marginalized groups. And this is partially the canary in the coal mine. And as you know, the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine is not to fix the canary, is that the canary is giving us an early warning system that there's bad air. And it's amazing how accurate that is. I had a colleague who was writing about subprime lending in the early 1990s. She's a black woman, and she was coming up for tenure. And people were saying, man, why didn't she write about something that's important? Okay, so a few black people got bad loans. Big deal. We should give her tenure because she's writing about a few black people getting bad loans? And then the subprime crisis hit. And all of a sudden, she was a rock star. and maybe she could have done it better, but really she was talking about using the canary as a diagnostic tool to understand the structure. So I think those of us who are in a privileged position, and my sense is you wouldn't be in this room if you weren't in a privileged position. I think all my Berkeley students, they may not feel it, students of color, students with disability, gay and lesbian students. So compared to Bill Gates, or they feel like they don't have any power, but compared to the person that didn't graduate from high school, or the person that's living in Palestine, the person that's who doesn't speak English, you have power. And if you can actually network, which I would use more than allies, network. Cornel West said, love, the justice is the public face of love. So I think one of the things we have to learn is that these things are deeply transformational, not just about the world out there, but about the world in here. So how do we actually, again, engage in relationships? I don't know if that's your son sitting there, but it's like not in a transactional way. That we actually are doing this not only to build power and to win, but because we deeply care about each other. Because we believe, not just cognitively, but emotionally as well as practically, that our lives matter, and we see that being violated every day. And so I think in that sense, I have this thing where I say interests, we talk about people having different interests, that interest is less stable, and what's more important are values. Values is less stable, and what's more important is being. So how do we actually begin to create a space where our beings can be acknowledged, celebrated, and supported? How do we actually exercise the public face of love? And it's not a prescription, I think it's an orientation. And so I do think coalitions and alliances oftentimes are too transactional. Mm-hmm. And once the action is over, we're done with those people. We're using them only as a means to an end, not because we really care about them.
On this note, thank you for an enlightening evening. This was a pleasure to listen to your framing of these issues, and I think we have a lot of thoughts for us. But I think we want to mobilize people to take action, to transform their being, and not to create alliances based on transactions, because transactions do not make a lasting imprint both on ourselves and on the community. Now, Zaytuna College is committed to transforming the Muslim community through a very deliberate process of education in order to transform ourselves so we'll be able to transform the society. It's a pleasure to have you with us in here. This is a place that's always open for you, your ideas, and it's a rich dialogue and a discussion, and hopefully we will overcome, but it's going to be a long struggle. Thank you very much. Please make sure to pick up the book. John Powell is going to sign the book outside for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being a sustainer of Zaytuna College as a member of 12,000 Strong. Tell your friends and family about the benefits of supporting America's first Muslim liberal arts college.